Welcome everybody to our webinar number 5, right in the middle. We've hit our midpoint here. Woohoo! My name is Meredith White. I'm in Metro Atlanta, Georgia, in Gwinnett County Public Schools. And tonight we are super excited to welcome the fabulous Dr. Celia Zamora. And we're going to talk about ACTFL, all of the resources available, what it all means together, and really just how to leverage what is available to us as language educators. Celia, will you introduce yourself? Tell us where you are. I know where you are and who you are, but for those who haven't met Celia, will you tell us what you're up to and where you are these days?
Sure. So I'm so happy to be here with Meredith. My name is Celia Chomón, and I'm the Director of Professional Learning and Certification at ACTFL. But because we are remote, I am in Tampa, Florida. So both of us are going, as we were just talking about, hot girl summer. And yeah, I oversee anything regarding professional development, professional learning, e-learning, as well as certification. And I'm just really happy to be here to support educators and support language learning and language advocacy, as I always do.
Yay. Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, it's going to definitely be a hot girl summer, a sweaty girl summer, a humid girl summer, just all the things. I often refer, whether it's like podcast episodes or webinars or just conference sessions, because I definitely need more hobbies, clearly. I often refer to ACTFL as the mothership, and it's jokingly, lovingly, because that is kind of how I think of it when I think of the structure of our state organizations like FLAG,
Right.
and then feeding obviously into the regional, and then feeding into ACTFL. I mean, the processes and just the professional development offered and the resources, just all of these things are so streamlined in so many ways. What do you think is the biggest, when you look at all of that, resources, people, the in-person conference, of course, anything, the SIGs, the special interest groups, everything available, what would you say from your point of view and from your experience are kind of the most utilized things that people take advantage of that ACTFL offers? And what would you say are the least utilized or kind of underrated that people might not realize?
So that's a great question. Obviously, I'm a little biased because I am the Director of Professional Learning and
Yes.
Certification. But I definitely say that our most popular kind of, resource, and that's really what people know ACTFL for, is our annual convention,
Hmm.
which, I mean, it's international. You gather all of these amazing minds from all over, and you share best practices and best resources, and you get to see the teachers of the year. And I mean, it's just such a great energy. I love ACTFL. Even before I ever worked at ACTFL, I loved ACTFL. ACTFL conferences. Also, our membership is great too. There's so many wonderful things included with our membership, like the language educator, which now we moved away from having. There was the email. I'm sorry. We went from focus
You get
topics.
an
I know
email?
I get
Unbelievable. I
emails
don't believe
past 5 p.m. I know,
it.
right? So we go from having, the language educator, where you can only submit certain focus topics, but now you can submit any articles. So there's a wonderful chance for teachers to, start publishing and sharing best practices if they can't necessarily make it to our annual convention. I mean, membership also includes the special interest groups, which are such a great kind of place, and even just the mentorship programs, the parent share. And of course, our workshops, our professional development, our assessments, the Apple, the OPI, a lot of wonderful things. But I still think that our most underutilized thing is actually our professional learning, because there is so much and there are so many things happening at ACTFL that I think it's tough to keep up with it. And it's so difficult to kind of get in there and see all of the wonderful resources that we offer. So really it's just getting the word out and word of mouth of, hey, we're offering all of these great workshops. You can become OPI certified. You can become a rater. You can do micro learning or e-learning or asynchronous and synchronous workshops. So, I mean, really just there's a lot that people don't realize that we do have.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, for sure. Because I think of ways, we talk a lot about getting engaged, like from an organizational standpoint, like in state organizations or regional, it's like get engaged, get involved.
Right.
And I don't know that, yeah, I don't know that it's always obvious just because everybody's busy. And, if you go to a website, you're only looking for what you're looking for. So you're like, oh yeah,
Exactly.
when's the, what city is the, convention in this year? Okay, that's it. And you might not peruse around. And I think, yeah, if people knew like really the offerings there and the ways to get involved and the ways to get engaged and all those kind of
Yeah.
things, even just to like volunteer. And because you go
Yep.
to these things, right? And you see these people and you're like, hey, how did they? Sometimes it's as often as just asking, and being like, hey, did you guys know
Absolutely.
anybody to whatever, whatever?
And I'm so glad you brought that up because a lot of times people think that volunteering is like this multiple year commitment that you have to serve on the board or that you have to be like this really involved person. And then people think, well, I have kids at home, I work already a massive workload, there's absolutely no way. But we have so many micro volunteer opportunities
Mm,
that maybe just take a few weeks, or it takes a project, or it's a few months, or it's
mm,
at your own pace. And then, of course, eventually, once you volunteer in one thing, then you start volunteering more and more and more and more. And then all of a sudden, you might be on the board, or maybe you never get on the board. We have so many wonderful volunteers and people that have been very
yeah.
involved with ACTFL that have never served on the board because that's just not their cup of tea. But there is really there are so many different ways for everybody, regardless of your personality style or what you're comfortable with, to get involved. So it's
Hmm.
just a matter, like you said, of asking or just reaching out to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's super important to point out because yeah, you go, geez, I don't want to, get
Right.
into something and then your life circumstance changes and you're like, I don't have, like you said, 4 years or,
Right.
whatever. Or you might, and you're like, yeah, I want to take on, a
Exactly.
serious thing. And I think that's super true. I love that. I'm totally stealing micro volunteer because that's totally what it is, where you're just like, boop, here and there, see how you feel. I know for me as kind of a micro volunteer on different things, whether you said it's like, being an evaluator of sessions for
Right.
programs, or like you said, a rater, or, all sorts of different things, just gives you insight into, like a process, like
Mhm.
proposing a session for the convention, or being, helping decide who gets an award or different things like that. It's just
Yeah.
such a nice insight on something that may feel super like off limits and like
Yep.
fancy and important, because it's like you might go, oh, well, there's no way they, only whatever, like people who are leaders in different ways, or like that's not really for me. And it's like, yeah, it can be absolutely, like that's how you get involved, is you just give a little of yourself and see if you like
Yep.
it, and see
And
what
two
you think.
things with that, and one in my personal experience. So my mothership for an associations is ASAE,
Mm,
the American Society of Association Executives. And
mhm.
in fact, it's just funny you said that because I was volunteering. I was micro volunteering to be on an award selection committee. And I never thought I was ever going to apply for that award because why would I? All these people are so put together and so fabulous. And I was reading the applications and I was looking at the rubric saying, oh my gosh, I absolutely could do this. Like I absolutely, and I did apply the next year and I did get it. So that's
Mhm.
something that I don't think I would have ever had that confidence had I not
Mhm.
really peeked behind the curtain. And apart from that, I always hear from people that have worked either in a small project, like either helping us with item writing or becoming raters, saying that the best thing that they ever did for their classroom was become an Apple rater or an OPI rater because
Yeah.
it really you really study the rubric, study the arc, and really understand what is it that these evaluations, these assessments are asking of our students. And you really become so well versed in it and understand it so deeply that of course it bleeds into your classroom. And they always say that that's the best professional development they've ever gotten when they didn't really think that was professional development. They just thought they were doing something different.
Yeah.
So
Well, there's so many circles that we've made, like, just like in the field of education, not even like language education necessarily, but like in the field of education, we've made professional development like a bad word,
yeah.
where it's like this, like, oh, not those PD sessions. And
Yeah.
then you go to something like you said that may sort of non-traditionally be PD, like not seem like it. And then you're like, oh, wow, that developed me as a professional. And it's like,
Mhm.
yes, that's literally what it's
Professional development. It's
supposed
in
to do, right? Like it's what it's supposed to do. Imagine.
yeah.
I know for me it was one of those and especially getting involved like on a regional board at the time and now on our state board, like when I was a session like proposal on the
Yeah.
like proposal evaluation team, man, that helped me write proposals because I
Mhm,
was like you
mhm.
said, pull back the curtain. There was a year, I've done it a couple times, and there was, I think the first time I did it, I went back later And because it's all, blind, obviously, as you know, like all of
Of
those
course.
kind of things, I had rejected my own session. I had been like 1 out of 10, hate it. So
That
if
is a
there's
great story to say,
yes,
by the
I'm
way,
always like,
anytime that you tell people.
whoops. Yes. And if anybody's ever like, it's a conspiracy, they only, I'm like, no,
No.
because I wish it had been. And it's so funny, like just like you said, pulling back that curtain
Yeah.
and really examining some stuff. For me, that was very self-reflective because I reread it and I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, not
I can
great,
see why. I
Yeah.
see. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Like super vague, super whatever. So that helped me do better in that aspect.
Right.
And yeah, absolutely. You read some of the award criteria or some of the, whether it's the facilitator stuff or the whatever, and you're like, oh, I could do that, because
Exactly.
it's not supposed to be off limits. The whole point is professional development
Right.
in lots
Yeah.
of different ways. Um, would you say so some of the resources for those, I know, especially like as an early teacher, all of the
Mhm.
things sounded like equally important to me. And
Yeah.
if you had asked me at like 22 what they all meant on their own, not sure I would have been able, maybe I'd have been able to do like a matching, but like open-ended, absolutely not. I'd have been like, I think the standards are because everything's coming at you like
Yeah, at the same
200
time.
miles an hour. Yeah, and
Absolutely.
especially and then if you're now in education as like a second career kind of a thing, it's
Yep.
like not only do you got to catch up on kind of like teacher school type things, but also just content like
Yep.
approaches, pedagogy, whatever. Is there like any kind of metaphor or any kind of like comparison or way that you think of those major components of language education and the pedagogy piece
Yeah.
that ACTFL is involved in? For example, like the guiding principles or what were the core practices, right? And then like the standards, the can-do statements. Is there anything to kind of help people visualize how all those things kind of fit together?
Yeah, and I will preface this by saying that I was one of those second career, I mean, technically first career,
Mhm.
but I was not an education major. I kind of got into teaching. I was an English major. I became a teacher, and within a few months of teaching English, they're like, "Hey, you speak Spanish, right? You can become a Spanish teacher because isn't that how we all become Spanish teachers, right?"
Right.
And I didn't know what ACTFL was until my third year of teaching languages,
Yes,
especially because
absolutely.
I was a one person department in
Yeah.
Miami, Florida. It just kind of assumed that everyone spoke Spanish there, so just kind
Mhm.
of like guide them. So by the time that I did get my teaching certification and everything, it was a crash course, and like you
Yeah.
said, it was a lot of things coming at you apart from even just the behavioral and
Yeah.
how to write a lesson plan and so forth. So kind of how I always made it out to be, and this is not like an official kind of statement that we have at ACTFL, but this is kind of how I always learned it and how I explain it to people, is that when you talk about the world readiness standards for learning languages, you talk about the proficiency guidelines and the can do statements, right? I like to think of it as a house. So the first part is you have to have a very solid foundation, regardless of what kind of house you're going to build, whether it's a condo, whether it's like a multi-family home, like a beautiful, perfect, high standard superior home, or whether you're building a nice little one bedroom apartment, novice, regardless of what your journey is going to be, you need a foundation. And that strong foundation are the standards, right? Because you can't basically have, unless you have really clear, comprehensive standards as to what's important. And we're talking about the standards, we're talking about, communication, cultures, connections, comparisons, and communities. If you don't have those and you don't have the way to like kind of lead it forward, if you don't have that strong foundation, you cannot build anything on top of that, because that's those are the standards, right? So that is a really important thing. Then after that, then you have your blueprint, which are the proficiency guidelines, right? And with the proficiency guidelines, that's kind of like what starts telling you how you're going to be building these things. So what is this room going to look like? How many levels are you going to have? And within those levels, so if you're going to build a 2-story house, well, you know that in order for you to get to the second story, you need to have that first story set. And what is that first story? It's creating, in order for you to get to creating with the language, like an intermediate level, in order for you to ask questions and start creating with the languages and do simple sentences, you need to start off with listing words, phrases, very basic kind of like survival vocabulary. So it kind of leads you the blueprint as to how big, how tall your house is going to be, where all the rooms are. And then from there, how do you build your house? So you have this great foundation, you have the blueprints. How do you build them? It's the can-do statements. The can-do statements are the brick by brick of how you are building this proficiency and how you are setting these standards. So it can be either a can-do for a lesson, it can be a lot of bricks, which sometimes people do the can-dos for their units, the can-dos for the entire semester. So depending on what your can-dos look like, those are the bricks that actually build your house. And then, of course, the guiding principles are all of these wonderful things that you add onto your house. So maximizing the target language you use, using authentic text. These are all of the things, the plumbing, the pipes, because with all of these, you can't have a house. You could have maybe a half-built house, but you're not going to have a beautiful house of proficiency without all of these things working together. So back to your question, which is the most important? I mean, they're all really important, but the really good thing to understand is that they all really do work together. Because if you want a classroom that is built on communication, then communication, obviously, you have your standards that are talking about how to communicate. Your guiding principles talk to you about maximizing target language use and designing communicative tasks. Then your can-do statements are basically showing or kind of telling your students what can they do with that communication. And the proficiency guidelines kind of guide you as to where that student is based on what they can do. So all of them really do work together. So if you kind of look at them as this interlocking thing versus just as completely separate entities, just like you wouldn't just give someone a blueprint of the house and not give them anything else to build with it, or you give them a bunch of bricks, but nothing to do with those bricks, they all have to work together to be successful.
That is
I
super.
hope that makes sense. It makes sense in my head. So
that's the title of my autobiography. It makes sense in my head. You know, like
yeah.
I thought it's like when you start a conversation with somebody and then you're like, sorry, you didn't hear the first part. Like you just start like
Yeah.
mid sentence, like mid thought. No, absolutely not. I am of course going to credit you and totally steal that because that is
Yeah, please do.
just such a sensical way of thinking about it. And like you said, sure, you can have those individual parts exist, but not really, like not
Right.
in a functional living space. And especially because I'm so glad you said that too about being like 3 years in, because and going like, okay, now what are we doing? Like now I can
Right.
figure out
Yeah.
this stuff, because I really do think that's so many people, or they're familiar with one piece. They're like, oh
Right.
yeah, the standards. And you're like, and also,
And yeah.
yeah. And it can feel like these kind of separate entities, but then people are exposed to them at different times. Or I know for
Right.
me, absolutely the textbook, which was my like,
Yep.
everything those first couple years was not real
Yep.
sexy teaching going on, because it was like, no, page 9, tomorrow, page 10.
Yeah, I know. Exactly.
Surprise,
We're gonna
surprise.
progress. Exactly.
Yeah, 2 days from
Yeah.
now, page 11. Oh my, who would have guessed? It was, yeah. But what can you do, right? You only have what you have. And absolutely the like triangle and the standards and all of those things were on like the introductory pages of the teacher's
Right.
edition, 100% like next, and went right past
Mm-hmm.
you to like, is there a quiz? What is the first chapter? What's the topic?
Right.
What's the theme? All those kind of things. So I think that is really, 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 really nice to think of it in that way of how they work together with that great like function metaphor, because yeah, you really can't have any of the others. I know there have been a couple people too who have said, like you said, the guidelines, like that's what was the 6 core, but now are the guiding principles. And those are just, like you said, like if just flashy, snazzy, you want like the best day of your teaching career, you're doing all
Yeah.
6 of these,
Right.
like this, just things like that I think people see and go, oh my gosh, like that's a lot to do. That's a lot to expect
Right.
of oneself. Like I have to do all these things, but the answer is yes. I think we get better at them over time too. Has that been your experience? And is that, when you look at teachers professionally developing, do you feel like it's kind of one piece at a time, kind of wrapping their mind around all these different things like the guiding principles? And is there any advice you have, or any way that you see people really effectively kind of make their goals to really
Yeah.
familiarize themselves with all of those resources?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in that question. So the first thing I will say is we started doing kind of like a crash course to ACTFL in some of the regionals this year. And we do have like that workshop available also online. And the reason that we did that is back to your point that there are a lot of teachers that are not familiar with ACTFL, or that they kind of heard about it maybe in like their teacher education, or they never went through teacher education. And then all of a sudden you realize you're in your third year and you're like, I don't know what ACTFL is. I don't know how to do a can-do statement. And the last thing that you want to do is be judged, right? Like you show up to a convention, you show up to the regionals and say, hi, can anyone help me? I don't understand what a proficiency guideline is. And you're terrified that people are going to look at you and say, how on earth are you in your third year of teaching and you don't know what ACTFL is? What have you been doing? So we kind of created that crash course, one, to help new teachers, especially teachers that never went through an education program, but also we frame it as a refresher so that people can feel like they have a safe space to ask these questions. Like, no, absolutely no judgment. If you've never been able to successfully write a can-do statement, this is the time to ask and this is the time to learn, right? So with that said, the guiding principles, they're so great because they're obviously research-based. It is really the absolute way to maximize your language classroom and to do the best things for your students. But I always tell teachers, you do the best that you can with the resources that you have and the bandwidth that you have. And most importantly, you are enough. And I always tell teachers, the most important thing that you can do in your classroom is to create relationships with your students and to make them feel safe. Because right now, that's really like the kind of like environment that we're living in. And students don't learn if they don't feel safe. And students don't learn if they don't feel cared for and basically loved, right? So that everything else can come after that. We can build relationships and cultivate relationships within the target language, within backward design and authentic text. But most importantly is building those relationships. Now, from there, you do the best with what you can on that specific day. Every day you try your best. And if you can't necessarily meet that 90% target language, or you can't maximize the target language that day, and you really only get to quote unquote 60%, it's okay. We have another day. It's an average, right? It's not like
every police, like, hello.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, who's really measuring? Like, and no one has a transcript. And they're actually doing the math because no one has time to do math now and say, okay, you only got to 85%, so we're going to write you up.
Better watch it. Right.
Exactly. And backward design can mean so many things. Is backward design, from one unit to there, or is it a day to there? I mean, and honestly, in the 15 years that I taught, I never had one year that was just like the other, or even one class. I had, for instance, the exact Spanish 2, period 2 and period 5, and they were completely different classes just because of the dynamics of the classroom, of how many times we got interrupted. I mean, there are so many things that go into teaching that those are really wonderful, attainable goals that we should all strive to do as much as possible. But it does not make you less than if you cannot reach them. So I don't want people to constantly compare themselves thinking that this is a checklist, that if I don't meet these things every single day, then I am not a good teacher. Absolutely not. And I did get better because I know for a fact that my first year teaching is nothing compared to my last year of teaching. Like, I definitely, like anything, you practice, you hone in your craft, you see what works, what doesn't work, and you fail fast, right? In terms of how to help teachers, every time that I would go into a workshop or even any conference presentation, I would tell them, if you can take away one thing that you can use in your classroom tomorrow, then that is good. And then we can always build from there. But everything that is, Rome wasn't built in a day, and a lot of things just are step by step, or how they say in Spanish, piano a piano, right? Like little baby steps. So if all you can leave here today is knowing how to write a good can-do statement, great. Let's do that. And then little by little, let's start adding, okay, now let's talk about the world readiness standards. So within that can-do statement, within that lesson, can you look at how many C's you have? Is there a way to incorporate more C's? If you have 2 C's this lesson plan, what about next time? Do you think you can incorporate different C's? And then from there, kind of say, okay, well, what are you asking of your students? If your students are Spanish 2 or 3, which can mean anything, right? Spanish 2 or 3, you'll probably still have novice and you'll probably still have advanced within the same classroom. But what are you having your students do? So if your students are Spanish 2 intermediate, and you were having them write in the past tense this entire paragraph, maybe there's a reason why your students are not meeting that task because you're not understanding what can actually be done at intermediate. Those are more advanced tasks. So little by little, you kind of start understanding where your students are at. And again, all of these kind of coming together because once you really understand where your students are at, then you can create better can-do statements, which then help you create better lesson plans, which then help you create, add in all these C's.
Mm-hmm.
One way that, and I know that you'll appreciate this, one way that I found that has been really helpful for teachers is AI,
Yeah.
especially ChatGPT. Put in a lesson that you already have, like put in a lesson plan that you already have and say, okay, I have X number of students, X number of class times with, 60-minute classes 3 times a week. Spanish 2, which are around probably novice, high, intermediate, low. I do need differentiated instruction because I have some students that are probably intermediate high and novice mid. Can you please help me formulate can-do statements for this lesson plan? Okay, and then you look at it and then you say, okay, it looks like your can-do statement's a little bit too broad. Can you please help me specify it for these specific lesson plans and differentiate them? And then say, can you tell me from the World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages, which of the 5 C's are represented here? Okay, is there a way that you can help me add, for instance, let's just say that you had culture and comparisons. Is there a way that you can help me add communication? Is there a way that you can help me create a task that is not just interpersonal, but also presentational? Is there a way for you to create, ChatGPT will really help you. Now, it's not an end all be all. You definitely have to feed it and it's a skeleton, like a jump off point, but it has been really, really helpful for teachers to start feeling comfortable because now I can do it in my sleep. I've done it for so long that for me, I can look at a lesson plan and say, if you just tweak this and add this and add this, and then instead of having them do this, have this, all of a sudden I have all of these things covered. But that took a very long time for me to do. So if you're just starting, there's nothing wrong with leveraging a little bit of help to get you comfortable with being able to do that.
Yeah.
So I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. That's such great advice too. And I really appreciate just your words about being enough because it really there's so much pressure. Of course I dropped it. Oh, pen, come back. And of course it bounces on 3 different things and goes like as far away as possible. It's like when you drop toast.
A typical day. Yeah.
It's a normal day. It's fine. You drop toast. You're like butter side down. Of course it is.
Yep.
Whatever. Oh, well, we'll just write with something else. Because I was taking notes as you were talking. I appreciate that sentiment of just genuinely like that people are doing enough, that there is no expectation of like doing all the things all the time in all the ways every day for all the student. Like it's so overwhelming. And then if you're in some place that like we were saying, like you were the department, like you were the language teacher, even if you're in that situation, or if you're surrounded by other language teachers in a huge department, like mine, both of those can be lonely. Both of those can be not lonely. Both of those can be incredibly productive and helpful or incredibly toxic. I always think of everyone's teaching situation as like their fingerprint, it's completely unique. It's completely like it's your family situation, it's your training or lack thereof, whatever all of that even means. Like there's so many things. And then, like you said, when you're going like year 3, like, oh, I should 3.1. What does that mean? Like you're seeing something on somebody else's stuff. Like we've got to get to a place where just everybody, you can go to a session or go to a thing and say, I am so sorry. Like, please, I am here to learn. And I maybe should know this by now, but I don't. And you can just be open and vulnerable and people go, no problem, and you get that crash course because I think all of the resources are too valuable on their own and together for somebody to be turned off because someone said, how do you not know that? And it's like, oh, done. Like
and we wouldn't do that to our students, right?
Yeah.
Like if our students genuinely wanted to learn something, we wouldn't turn them away and say, oh, you should have known that like in Spanish 1, right? Absolutely not. Like we would if somebody generally wants to learn, absolutely, we're going to reach,
Yeah.
that olive branch. And one thing also, like even for instance, the proficiency guidelines, I've taught teachers to utilize the proficiency guidelines, not just for their students and their assessments, but also talking to parents. And
Amen.
really, for example, like those Apple resources where it kind of shows you like a typical progression of a student and how long, more importantly, how long does it really take for someone to
Yes.
go from novice low to advanced low, right? So then for example, there was a parent once that came up to me during open house when I was teaching, saying like, okay, so we're going, I expect my child to be able to lead our family reunion in Spain by the end of the summer. And I'm like, sir, this is Spanish one. Like if you're I'm like, they'll be able to kind of like say like
Oh,
hello.
I was gonna say,
Like
is the
where,
topic my school day? You know,
yeah,
because like
exactly. Where's the bathroom?
gonna
And do
kill
you
them.
want to hear about my clothes? Like, do you want to hear how I look?
That's right. What
But
do I like to eat and what clothing? Think like what
yeah,
clothing do I wear? That is all. You know, like
and I
no.
can do it in lists, right? And maybe start creating sentences. I mean, if I'm like really, really into, but then even
Right.
talking about the fact that when you talk to an administrator and they tell you, well, you meet with your students 3 times a week for 60 minutes. It's like, do we though?
Right.
Between early release, days off,
Mhm.
between field trip days, between having standardized assessments, between our own assessments, between a child being sick, between pep rally days, between a fire drill, between there's so many things. I would be really surprised if every single student was actually in the classroom for 180 minutes a
Right.
week. And I mean, it
Absolutely.
doesn't happen. And then there's like so many things that get into the way of a school day that we have no control over. So we already don't see our students enough to really assist them with this language learning. And then apart from that, you're putting all of these obstacles in our way.
Absolutely. Well, for
So
sure. We know too, like the science, like you were saying about the like guiding principles and all those things, like it's research based and the research is clear and the science is clear with in regards to like motivation and language being
yeah,
compelling. And so we also know that not all of our students are sitting in our classes like to like
processing.
first
Yeah,
route, yeah, like being a
right.
total word nerd. Like I mean, like I always say my high school Spanish teacher, who was the reason I became a Spanish teacher, she was like my insider. She was dealing me like grammar on the side. I mean, if she had like a sketchy little trench coat and she's like, "You want preterite? I got preterite." Like she'd give me
You want
like
an AP
I
Spanish,
know. Yeah, we had like a whole AP workbook. I did AP like on my own because I didn't have room for it in my schedule. And I'm telling you, she's like, "You want some conditional? You want some subjunctive?" Like she was so fun and made it so accessible
Yeah.
because she knew I was a word nerd. And I'd be like, interesting, you said a word yesterday, or I'd hear her use hecho or puesto, some kind of irregular in some way.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, wait a minute, está puesto, but so it's the same with like he puesto. And she's like, yes, not that is because we are weird. We are word nerds. We are weird. Like
Yeah.
our just average student, it, might be, this is so, I hate saying this out loud, but like for a lot of their classes or a lot of the things in their lives, because they are young people who don't have a lot of control over their lives, they might be checking a box. They might be sitting
Yep.
in French one. They really wanted to take Arabic, but it was full. Or they're sitting in, Chinese 3 because 1 and 2 were fine, but they didn't really care, but their parents made them take it. You just never know their motivations. And like you said, we also don't know how much time we ever actually get with them. And that's
Right.
if we're never absent. That's like if
Exactly.
nothing ever comes up with our own, whatever.
Exactly.
It's just really tough to determine. So I think that's awesome that you share that because that was your experience too. Because yeah, I don't know who among us has not heard in a parent conference of like, yeah, I just want them to be, or how fluent will they be?
Yeah.
What
Like, well,
Spanish are they learning? What, all these questions that you're like, if only it were that easy.
yep.
But it's not. And like you said, a lot of the resources, and learning about them for our students actually, in the process, obviously make us stronger educators. For me, it was the modes. I would be, it would
Mhm.
be like literally just what the modes, and then being, and I remember in my head being like, am I? have I lost? I thought I was like a pretty smart person, but like, where'd the modalities go? Like I had always, and then I was like, oh, those are, okay, got it, and learning about the modes, I realized, well, no, duh. That's why you're like, if I went and suddenly, because again, sometimes you're planning some years, especially early on, you're planning day to day. It would be like, kids going, what's on the quiz tomorrow? You're like, girl, I don't know. I haven't made it yet.
We'll find out together. It'll be a surprise.
It'll be like the movie theater. We're watching it for the first time. I don't know, and that's when you find a typo, obviously, is when they all already have the papers you've already printed. Good grief. So, I mean, printing them off the classroom computer, like, or printer right before
Yep, as they're coming in. Yep.
Yeah, like,
in there, or that you just put it on your smartboard and you're like, everyone's going to do it on their own paper because didn't have time to go.
and they're like, yeah, or you've printed on the papers. Why are these papers warm? They're not, let it go because I just printed them. So we get so caught up in the hustle and bustle. For me, it would be those moments of like, oh, you're giving your students an assessment that maybe came from the book or came from your team, but you maybe were just like, yeah, sounds great. And then as they're taking it, you're like, oh, this has like 2 audio tracks or 2 things that we've created ourselves, listening wise. And we haven't done a listening practice in 2 weeks or whatever. Like I would constantly not be able to keep up with that. All of a sudden we do writing every day, but then not a speaking or not a listening. So for me, really like diving into the modes, like you said, seeing some models, not with AI, yet at the time, but seeing some models of other people's ways that they were putting like modes together, like sample lessons, sample curricula. I mean, life-changing to see people that were like, hey, let's change, that family, I got that classic family tree project, right? Which is basically labeling, at least the way I was doing it. But somebody else had made it. Somebody else had the rubric. And I was like, I'm swamped and I don't know how to design a project. I'm like, I'm 22. Like, what am I going to do? And seeing some people really, like you said before, like pose some thoughtful questions. Like, what do you think about maybe instead of family tree, like a circle of care, or asking some compelling questions? Like, can you love a family member, but not really like being around them? You know what I mean? All those kind of things that you're like, oh, that's some big kind of life stuff. That makes for much more interesting than tell me about 3 family members, or whatever. And then from there, seeing how they did the modes and like the tasks the students were given, that's so powerful just to see examples. And we have so many prolific sharers in our field, which is like so amazing. I don't know if other content areas do, but I can't imagine that they do more. Because it's just
I haven't, at least not in English literature. I never really saw like the amount of like collaboration that we and the sharing that we do in world languages. And like even back to your family, you're thinking of how to involve more C's, right, than just kind of like the labeling the family tree. We'll talk about, let's talk about comparison. How are family roles different? How is the mom viewed differently in the target language culture and here, and in whatever culture you're bringing from home? And then, so let's not only do community, let's not only read it, but let's also discuss it. And then let's also, we have comparison, you have culture. And then even talking about how families are different. You have a school family, and you also have, a family like in your community, maybe you have uncles that aren't really your uncles. And there's like so many different ways within that same kind of like boring old topic to bring in such life to it. And back to your original point about our students just kind of like don't really care, or like some students are just there to check off a box. I loved hearing all the things that you say, because completely removed from ACTFL, but not really. In my previous life as a linguist and researcher, you were kind of like hitting all the boxes as to the noticing hypotheses, depth of processing, awareness, attention. And those are the things. And so much research has shown that the more you process a language and the more that you become aware of it, kind of like what you were saying, I realized that you said dormir, but then you said durmió and the vowel changed.
Right.
Like, what's up with that? And then you start, like, that's noticing. And then you start thinking about it, and then you start coming up with the rules. And even if the rule that you first come up with is wrong, but you thought about it and you processed it and it stays in there, that's what we need to get our students to do, whether it's through informational gap-based tasks, whether it's through like, like my professor, my mentor, Dr. Ron Leao at Georgetown, he would do crossword puzzles, whereas the students were doing in novice, by the way, crossword puzzles. It's when they realized that when they have to put that durmió, it does not go with an O, it goes with a U. And then they were like, wait, that doesn't make any sense. Or even I would do like little like I would give like my students little sheets of paper where they had to like write like a sentence, and the sentence was, for example, a él le gusta comer, and so then what they didn't understand why there was an extra A in there. They're like, where does this A go? And it's like because a él le gusta,
Right.
or things like that make them kind of sit there and go, what? And then they start
Mm,
figuring out. That's how you really get that language in there. It's processing, kind of like what you were doing. And on
absolutely.
a completely different side note, by the way, it has nothing to do with anything we're talking about, but I chuckled. When you talked about the typos on the test, a really great thing that I did my 5th year of teaching is I would tell my students, I will randomly hide errors in my homework, my thesis, everything that I do. And whoever can point out that error gets a candy that day.
Yes.
And then, of course, any
Favorite.
typo or anything they found, they're like, "Oh, Ms. Zamora put it there." I'm like, "I sure did. Here's your candy."
You got me. Thank
So
you.
anyone like, feel free to use that. Anybody who would like it out there.
Plus
Yeah,
10 points. They're like, yes.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, House Gryffindor, 10 points. So
That's so funny. To ting, yeah, no, absolutely. Anything that makes them, pay attention to things
yeah,
and like you said, just notice like language is supposed to be fun. Language is
yeah,
supposed to be I'll say I've just always philosophically felt that language is supposed to be easy. Like not because it is easy, but we can't gatekeep. We
right,
can't
right,
be like, well, the only way you get this right is if you're required to put the and you should have noticed that a long time ago.
right.
Things like that are like to me the complete opposite um of how it works, and I at the same time humanly of course realize that you might be in level, I mean I'm making this up, but like if it's like Spanish level 8 and like for 8 years and they've never noticed that, I mean I might be thinking in my head like, "You
Where have you been?
right, like you've never noticed that?" Or but we keep, we don't have to like acknowledge that. We just, yep, exactly. It's how we've said like a mí me gusta, or whatever connection that we put it with, and they go, "Oh yeah, okay." And it's neither here nor there, but I've for a long time I think I was seeing either like around me or just we're taught to teach this way or whatever
Yeah,
kind of not that, and it was
yeah,
such a relief to like take the
yeah,
pressure off myself, to take the pressure off students, and to really take the should out of there, and
yep,
like you said, really study before, like really study those levels and go, oh my gosh, why was I like gatekeeping the preterite? Because, they'd ask, I mean, just innocently, you know how it
yeah.
goes. Like kids are just writing and they're like,
How do you say this? Yeah,
right,
yeah.
how do you say I went? And you could just be like, oh, fui. You could just tell them the word. But what was I doing for, the first several years of my
We're
teaching?
not
Like,
there
oh, yeah,
yet.
we're not
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
You get
we're not
ready, girl,
there.
because it's coming. Chapter 3, and you've lost them. Like when you go,
Yep.
you just wait. Next year, we're gonna do a whole, and it doesn't matter how excited we are, or if it is your favorite chapter or whatever. They're like, you can't just. And the other thing we've done now is give it some kind of sense, I think at least, that like they won't be ready for it until then, which we know is like not a thing.
Yeah, absolutely
And
not.
and it also makes it seem like hard, like, oh, that's a next year skill. It's fui. Write it and move
Yeah, write
on.
it down. And if you learn that one word, I mean, great. I mean,
Yes.
there's so many different ways to learn. I feel like sometimes we get in our heads about like how the best way to learn is. Like if you
Yeah.
didn't learn it, like and like a lot of purists out there, I'm of the mindset that language is something that's living. Language
Yeah.
will constantly change. I mean, every year we add new words to our dictionary, right? Because that is life. I mean, selfie was not a word 20 years ago.
Right.
We were not selfieing with like our little like disposable cameras, right?
Right.
So Spanish in any target language is the exact same way. And if we're really preparing our students to go out there and communicate
Right.
with people who speak the language, we really need to prepare them to really communicate. It's funny because until I really started, like, until I got to a certain level of Spanish and I found a textbook, that was the first time in my life that I realized that people said la red instead of internet. And I was like, what? Like the what? And I was like, internet. And I was like, and mind you, my first language is Spanish, and I never
Right.
heard anyone say la
You're like,
red. And so then I'm like, do I not know Spanish? And then when we start talking about heritage language speakers, and then I had so many of my students that came from teachers who taught kind of like, Spaniard Spanish, and then they go to Miami to try to communicate with Spanish speakers, and you're gonna mostly get Cuban Spanish there, which
right.
is a completely different animal that they are, dropping R's and speaking fast and using so many different things. I mean, even me, like learning Japanese, I mean, I, of course, felt very great with like my very formal Japanese. And then you go to Japan and it's like, they're talking to me like, I'm sorry, one more time. I'm like, what, come again?
Right.
Because no one speaks textbook Spanish.
Yeah.
No one speaks textbook Japanese. Like they
Right.
speak like so it's okay if you drop a preterite or like if you misuse a preterite, they'll still understand you.
Right.
They will mostly understand you. So the
Absolutely.
point that if they're excited about communicating, and even if it means that maybe they communicated a little wrong, there is a place and time to give feedback and like not destroy their confidence and say, oh, everything that you just said was wrong.
Right.
No, just do it. What can you do with that language? And that's where kind of like where the can do's come from. What can you do versus what you
Right.
can't? I can't tell you how many times I talk to people anywhere. Even yesterday when I was getting my hair cut, that someone said, oh, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I work with languages and I'm a linguist. And they're like, oh my gosh, I took French for 4 years and I can't say anything with it. And I'm like, I'm sure you could.
Sure
I'm
you
sure you
can.
could say some
Right.
things with it. I'm
Right.
sure you're focusing on what you can't do.
Right.
Maybe why don't you try focusing on what you can?
Right.
And that's kind of the message that we have to give to our students. So
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's a conversation that we all are just like, oh, geez, it almost makes you like, I have to, if my husband and I are out and if somebody goes, oh, what do you do? Or like, what do he's like, uh-oh. Cause I think he's realized like, I'm not always fun to talk to like out in the wild
yeah,
because yeah, what do you say? And then people go, oh, geez, like you said, and it's always like so many years. They go, I took 6 years of Latin. I don't remember. Yes, you do.
yes,
Yes, you
of course
do.
you do.
Yeah, of course you do. So if it was French and I'm not like, oh bonjour, you're not gonna be like, what? Like, yes, you do. Merci beaucoup. Like,
Yeah,
you know what? I'm saying, come on, so it's absolutely something that we hear so often. And I know every content area has like their thing. And
yeah, of
I
course.
always
I
love
can't do math,
that's
or I
right. Like,
can't
oh,
do
I hated
anything. Yeah,
math. And they're like,
exactly.
cool story. Jeez. Like, I know Ted Zero, when he was ACTFL Teacher of the Year 20, yeah, whatever, 10 years, maybe 8 years ago, 2016, 2017, I would always tell the story about as a Latin teacher, he hears, who are they going to talk to? The Pope, and he's like, okay. And then he had a student go meet the Pope and
Not,
speak to him in Latin. And the Pope was
there you
like,
go.
you're talking in Latin. And he said this in Latin. So Tezero's got
There
like,
you go. See? There
yes.
you
And he
go.
was like, actually, they will. Now, and when that kid came back and had like a meet and greet with the Pope in Latin, handed him his Latin Club t-shirt that said like always cool.
Oh,
It said like always smooth, sometimes cool, something really funny, but like in Latin. So this kid has this great memory and Ted's like, yeah, so there.
I did that. Yeah, exactly.
But it's the same thing like you said, Spanish. I mean, you can hear really really problematic stuff that people will say about languages. You can hear about their own experience. I mean, it's just we get a lot. Language is so personal and language learning
It
is so
is.
personal. And it's all of that identity work and people, it's a performance-based thing. So people feel self-conscious,
Oh
or
yeah.
they automatically want to tell you that they had a really negative experience or that their teacher was amazing. And it's like,
Yep.
so many kind of polarizing things. You made me, I laughed with the can-do statements because yes, I don't remember who said it a few years ago, but it's always stuck with me where they're called the can-do statements, not the can't conjugate statements. And I'm like,
True.
yes, right. Like,
Absolutely.
don't put the pressure on kids to, or yourself, because I'm not a native speaker. I'm constantly reeling through stuff and you hear it and you sort of noticed it late and you're like, it's too late, whatever. You heard yourself say it wrong and it's whatever somebody understood you and things moved on. It's just, we've
Yeah.
put, again, with the pressure, we've put so much pressure, or it's been put on us for
Yeah.
so
Oh yeah.
long. And you're like, the actual police are not going to show up at your door and be like, hey,
No.
couple of things. Wow, 74% target language yesterday. Let's work on that. Also, you taught, dormio and not dormio. So you're canceled, like it's not, it's not
No.
that, it's not that serious. I even coming from a large district with phenomenal supervisors and just a really, really great place to teach a language. Um, have even told some of the new teachers when they're looking at the, district assessments, which are an option, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to get to this final? This is so many questions. I'm like, it's only that many because they know that the final exam blocks are like 2 hours. It's like literally like it's kind of all the things about school that we can't really fix
Right.
tomorrow.
Right.
So I'm like, and also it's like multiple choice, and it is what it is. You can also change it. No one's going to come to your door and go like, did you give the one we gave? It's an option. And I'm lucky to be in a
Yeah.
place where it is an option. And there is some say, teachers have say in making it. Not everyone's going to love it, but there are resources if you want them. And if you don't, there's also no micromanaging and kind of policing, for lack of a better verb again,
Exactly. Yeah.
of just like, well, and like you said, now you're written up because you didn't give the thing and they don't know the preterite by now. And just this laundry list of things that
Right.
are like, what is that? What? Like, it's a lot.
And also, and I always tell my students the first day of class every single year, I have never met a perfect monolingual speaker. Even
Right.
a person who only has one language and
Mhm.
literally puts all of their effort and life into one language,
Yep.
and they're still not going to be superior. Not everyone that speaks a target, like their own one language is superior. So, like this idea of like native speaker and everything, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
it's not true. I always tell my students, people around you that only speak one language that make errors all the time. So why can't you? You're doing errors in two languages or three languages, so
Right.
great. So
No, I agree. I agree. There's
yeah,
so many things to reflect on. And for me, it was like learning kind of about all those things available and like learning kind of more about what other people are doing from, like I said,
yeah,
those sharers and Actual's resources, where I was like, oh, there is no right way, which I think we know, like somewhere deep down, but gosh, the day to day just classroom teaching is so fast paced, so go, 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 that
yeah.
it's like you start to feel, like, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna have time to learn this all. So I also really appreciate what you said before about one thing at a time. This year, maybe your goal is really to dive into those intercultural competence, aspects, and then next year, let's maybe look at, these kind of things. And you just kind of keep adding, because to me, that's the only way that learning about all those things was sustainable.
And more importantly, ACTFL is here to support you. ACTFL is here to help. We have our special interest groups. We have amazing members. We have our incredible convention. And even I think about a couple of years ago, we invited the various teachers of the year to have a webinar. And instead of best practices, it was called worst practices, because I wanted them to talk about
Mhm.
all of the things that have gone wrong in their classroom and all
Right.
of the ways that they've learned from it, because we kind of have like the teachers of the year on this pedestal as like they're like these perfect 100% perfect teachers, and they're not. They've made as many errors as all of us have, and they don't have perfect teacher of the year days
Right.
every single day. So
Right.
even our most coveted kind of like teachers, they're human. We're all human, and we're just doing the best that we can, and that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Claudia Elliott and I were talking this morning with Berta Delgadillo, a couple more prolific sharers. And yeah, just talking about how appreciative we are when people share that sentiment,
Yeah.
and, blogging about a class that's maybe super difficult, like some people do in their different like communities. Anne Marie Chase is a wonderful sharer, and she blogged all last year about that darn sixth period,
Yeah.
and it's like,
It's always sixth
oh,
period.
it's always sixth period. Right. And so it was just like, man, Bertha's this year was fourth period. She was like, that darn fourth period, which for her was last.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so it's like, I don't know why we do that inner comparison thing where we're like, oh man, so and so shared X. They must be, like you said, we put,
Right.
the teachers of the year who obviously are excellent, but like in this weird category in our heads of like, oh, like they
Right.
must do, again, all the things all the time, every day for every kid. Like, no,
Exactly.
that's not,
Not possible.
nobody's doing that. Yeah. Nobody's doing, like, I don't know adults that do that at their job. I don't know adults who are doing that in their parenting, like in their
Exactly.
relationships. Like, that's not a thing. Why would we, especially in a job as hard as teaching, think
Exactly.
that anyone is, or that just because they're only sharing the highlight reel, that obviously they must
Yep.
be good at everything. It's like, oh
Yep.
no, again, ask Anne Marie about that sixth period, like,
Yep.
and that's really comforting. I think, because it's the support is nice. For me, the resources, knowing that ACTFL's there for support, and really just like learning the resources again, sustainably, one at a time, or whatever your goal is, also for me helps articulate what kind of support I need, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like knowing
Absolutely.
that you're like, I don't really know a lot about like, let's say I'm just looking even at the guiding principles, like, wow, backward design, definitely my weakness. Maybe now it's like a few years in of printing out the quiz, or the, period before, or you can't find last year. So you make it anew. And it's like, this is not, I've got to get my files
Yeah.
together. I've got to get my organization, because all of that, to me totally affects backward design, and just
Absolutely.
kind of, yeah, like adds unnecessary pressure to yourself. So even if you're setting your goals based on that, other things are going to come along with that. Suddenly maybe you're
Yeah.
like, my Google Drive looks better, and I'm making better assessments, which is helping me, imagine, which is helping me teach more peacefully. And then you bring a little bit more joy and pizzazz. And again, kids
Exactly.
win. I think kids win when all of those things come together. So
Yeah.
always nice to know, again, something that, like, an organization like ACTFL, that might feel like, oh my God, it's ACTFL. It's like, no, they'll respond to like a tweet, like if you email, I'll be like, hey, what's up? Like, question, and it's so nice that people are as responsive as they are, because when you finally do articulate what support means, there's resources for that. So you're like,
Exactly.
all right, I'm ready. Tell me where that crash course is. Tell me where, and
Exactly.
it's like, no problem. Here are some links, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Yay.
Absolutely.
I.e., you guys are great.
Well, so are you guys. I mean, you guys are what keeps us going. So absolutely, you guys are the real stars. So
We're doing the best we can. This has been so enjoyable, and I'm so thankful for your time. I just realized we went into the after party, so I'm so sorry.
yeah,
We
and
need
I
to.
realized how like dark it's gotten progressively darker, like in my room, and like, I didn't turn on the lights.
And I've gotten kind of like orange on the side, because it's like if the sun is setting and my window shade, oh, see, my window shades are
There
like
it
an
is. Yeah.
orange color, against HOA rules. So don't tell my HOA.
Oh, fun.
I know. They're supposed to be like beige, but we did bright orange. Whoops. Because it was fun and it looked good. And why not? They're pretty. They never said anything. So, but now I've put it on the internet. So now they will say something, won't they? No, this has been really, really great. And just thanks for all you do. We super
Absolutely.
appreciate you. And obviously on behalf of Flag and Klett, thanks. And for the after party, since now we're in cocktail hour, I think. When will we see you next? Philadelphia for sure, but I don't
Yes,
think I
for
see you
sure.
before then. I think just Philadelphia.
I don't know. I'm always around. I feel
That's
like
right.
I always run into everybody. So, and by the way, like if you guys ever run into me, like definitely grab me. And I'm always running around in 4-inch heels, right? I mean, like
Yes. It's the
my
only way
whole
to run
hashtag
around.
is high heels, higher goals. So,
Yes.
I mean, just grab me and talk to me, ask me whatever questions you want. I'm here to support you.
I love
So,
it. Oh, yay. Well, thanks so much. Super appreciate your
thank
time.
you.
And we'll be in touch. Yay.
Absolutely. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.